Alrighty. So this lecture will start with tissues, right? And we're gonna see epithelial tissue and muscle tissue today. So here are your key takeaways, some learning objectives, and additional resources. So here's the plan for the next classes. We'll talk about tissues and we'll see epithelial, muscle, and then later on we'll see connective and nervous. Okay? So first of all, I want us to remember what a tissue is, right? A tissue is a group of similar cells working together for a related function. And we have four primary types of tissue. Some tissue are called epithelial tissue, and epi means on top of, right? So these types of tissue, you see over here in the picture, this purplish, darker purple tissue on top, right? This is epithelial tissue. This is actually your skin, right? Here's the above your skin, and here this is the skin that is covering and lining you, okay? So epithelial tissue covers surfaces, it lines cavities and forms glands. So when you think epithelial, epi means on top of surfaces, right? It could be on top, like all of your skin is an epithelial tissue. It could be lining a cavity, right? Or it could be lining like inside your esophagus or your trachea, right? There's an epithelial tissue there too. Muscle um, allows, the main thing about muscle is that it allows contraction to allow movement. So here's some muscle and little filaments. This is one muscle cell, two muscle cells, three. And it actually, there's little fibers inside of these that contract in and out and they shorten and lengthen. So they allow movement, and we'll talk about that. Connective tissue um, is a bit the garbage can of all the tissues. When we don't know where to place something somewhere, then we put it in connective tissue. And so connective tissue connects things together and fills up space in the body. I like to think of it like the super glue of the body. It's what holds things together, right? Your lungs are not hanging in your thoracic cavity in empty space, right? They're not going bong bong back and forth. Your lungs are stuck there. It kind of filled with not cement, but they're filled with connective tissue to keep them in place so they're not bouncing around, right? That's an example of some connective tissue, but many things have connective tissue and it's kind of connecting things together. Nervous tissue sends electrical signals to communicate throughout the body. Nervous tissue, you think of the brain right away, right? That has nervous tissue. And this sends electrical signals to different neurons, right? Or to a muscle to do things. So it sends a communication to do things, right? One thing that's important, these four primary tissues, right? They interweave with each other to form the fabric of the body. Do you remember what the definition of an organ was? An organ is a grouping of tissues working together. Think of it. This is hierarchical building, right? A bunch of similar cells form a tissue. Many types of tissue come together to form an organ. Many organs come together to form an organ system. That's what we saw in our first class together. So, for example, right? Um, let's say the brain, right? Actually, let's think of something else. The heart, right? You would think that the heart, you know, that's all muscle tissue, right? That seems like something that contracts, right? Well, the heart is actually an organ, and by definition, it's made up of many types of tissue, right? The heart has a layer of epithelium over here, right? That actually covers and lines like the inner membrane. It has connective tissue around it to keep it in place. It definitely has muscle to contract, right? And it definitely has nervous tissue because certain nerves go to tell it and modulate its contraction. So I guess my point is that organs are made up of many types of tissue, right? But each of these tissues separately, they have their kind of specific function. So today we'll be looking at tissues and we'll be going through epithelial tissue. And I want you to not get lost in things. This slide, I want you to use it as your study guide. I want you to know that there's 4 primary tissue types, right? There's epithelial tissue, muscle and connective and nervous. But each of them have many subtypes underneath. And that's what we'll discover today. Now, I don't want you to get lost in this. If all gets very complex, right? All I want you to do is for each of these tissues to think of one verb, right? If it simplifies it in your head, think of one verb of what their function is. Epithelial tissue, epi means on top. So the verb I want you to think of is covers. Epithelial tissue covers things. Muscle tissue contracts, right? Connective tissue connects things together. Nervous tissue communicates things, okay? And we're going to go through each of these and their subtypes. So, epithelial tissue, sheets of tightly packed cells on a boundary next to an open space. Epithelial tissue are tightly bound because they're often a layer, right, that are covering something. So they really like to be nice and squeezed together. And there's some kind of an open space, okay? Here in skin, right, you see this nice purple epithelia. You see the little dots in here? Those are nuclei, okay? And this is this open space on top of your skin, right? So it's actually protecting you. This nice thick layer is protecting you from all the germs and gross stuff that's on the outside, right? From rubbing and breaking that skin. Here you have, this is actually a layer that is lining the trachea. This over here would be like the inner part of the trachea where air passes, and this would be an epithelial lining that lines the trachea. Okay. This over here has some glands. This is the salivary glands, and you see that this is a bit weird to see, but do you see these circles, right, with empty space in the middle, right? This empty space in the middle is where the glands will make stuff, right, and secrete it. Now, this gland one is a bit hard, but I want you to remember that when we take a slide, a histology slide with tissues on it, right, we actually slice through a certain organ or a gland, let's say, and we're just looking at a 2D image. But remember, this is a 3D image, right? So all these circles here, right, this comes from a gland. And glands kind of look like grapes. They have many little sacs where they make their stuff, and then they secrete it into these ducts. And all the ducts eventually merge together and get secreted out through a main duct, right? But if you chop a gland through the grapes and you look down at it, you're just going to see the circles of the grapes, right? And that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing these circles here, which are the grapes. And over here is probably where saliva is going to be inside, and it'll pass through these little ducts and come up out into some kind of a bigger process, right? Same thing over here. Here's some ducts and tubules. These circular things, right, in the kidneys, right, they're probably carrying certain substances, certain liquids. And remember, we're not seeing the whole 3D image here, but we're cutting through a certain portion and we're just seeing some of these little ducts that are in 2 dimensions, Okay, so you see these nice round ducts with stuff that's going to go and pass through the inside. So epithelial tissue, we know that the main function of this is that it covers. Right now, there's two categories here. There's glandular epithelium, which is for glands. Um, Glands produce things and secrete them out. Okay, they make stuff and then shoot it out, and it could be an endocrine gland, which means that it secretes its product into the blood, most oftentimes like a hormone, right? Exocrine glands, they secrete them into a lumen, which is into the outside part of the body. So for example, we'll see like a sweat gland. Okay, covering and lining epithelium, we have many types we'll talk about. The skin, which protects us, the respiratory tract, exchange gases, digestive, absorbs, urinary, filters some waste, reproductive, is important for reproduction and pleasure. Endothelium lines little blood vessels. So we'll talk about those. Now, what is the function of epithelia in general? First of all, this covering and lining epithelium, what's important for it is that it covers things. So oftentimes, sometimes it'll be a protective function, like a physical barrier. If it's very thick, it'll prevent mechanical stressors, right? Like, let's say your skin, right? If I scratch your skin, there'll be a big thick layer. I won't get to blood right away, right? Microorganisms, bad little pathogens, cannot get into our bloodstream right away. They need to pass a big, thick epithelium, which they're unlikely to, right? So our skin is constantly our first line of protection. And hot and cold, right? Skin actually prevents us from dehydrating. It's a nice, thick layer that retains water inside of us, right? When we get very warm, then blood vessels open to allow it to get out from the skin. When we're cold, we keep our heat inside. So this nice thick layer that protects us from hot or cold. These covering and lining, some of them help to regulate transport. Some epithelia are selectively permeable. Some allow us to absorb things and uptake nutrients. Where could this happen? Maybe the small intestine has this epithelium that likes to absorb things. Maybe the kidneys, which absorbs things back into the body. Excretion, some epithelia likes to release waste, right? I think of the kidneys as well over here. A lot of the kidneys will filter out stuff and excrete things out into a tube, which will then create urine. And some things like to filter, right, and separate substances. That's actually the kidney too. So the kidneys actually filter out things that they don't want into a tube that will become urine. Things they want to keep stay inside the tube. Epithelia also allows sensation with the help of nervous tissue because some sensations, like touch, involve epithelium and nervous tissue. Okay. Now, glandular epithelium, they produce secretions via glands. Okay. So, glandular epithelium, on top of doing these things, oftentimes glandular epithelium, they make their substance and then they secrete it out. It could be sweat, like sweat glands. It could be enzymes, like the pancreas has some glands that make pancreatic enzymes. Or let's say the salivary glands make amylase, which breaks down starch. Saliva, right? Hormones, different, actually, the pancreas again makes some insulin and glucagon that we saw. milk or oil. The mammary glands make milk. Um, the sebaceous glands in our hair make sebum, which makes our hair very oily. And mucus glands, right? Mucus glands, they make this gucky substance that is mucousy. It allows to capture bad bacteria in our respiratory tract. So epithelium forms the boundaries that separate us from the outside world, and nearly all substances that the body gives off or receives passes through an epithelium. So the two large categories of epithelia are covering and lining and glandular. Let's start with the covering and lining that cover all the free body surfaces. Where are these? They're in different lumens, ducts, and chambers. A lumen is a tube that you could pass a lumiere through to see at the other end, right? So it's a little tube, the inner part of a tube. And lumens oftentimes have an epithelium that are surrounding it. Look at this blood vessel here. It has this epithelium on the inside. So examples of these, right? Blood vessels, a chamber, an example of a chamber, like the heart chambers that collect blood. The stomach is a type of lumen. The intestines is a little lumen. It's like a little tube, right? Cavities, right? Certain cavities or have membranes, like the pleural membrane in the lungs, the pericardial membranes in the heart, the peritoneal membranes for digestion, right? In the GI, all the GI organs. And then covering and lining epithelium is sometimes found in the external environment. I told you that all of skin is our epithelia. This one's a bit weird. The oral cavity, oral cavity makes sense, right? Like our mouth. But the GI tract, and actually the respiratory tract too, why is that the external environment? The GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract, is a tube that goes from the mouth all the way to your rear end. One of my physiology teachers said that we are like one big donut, and we are just a hole that from mouth to anus, and all the rest of us is that middle good donut stuff, right? But we have a hole that goes all the way out, right? And it's one continuous track that's intertwined. So all of that track in my head, right, that is the external environment, right? Because it's connected to the outside world in a way, right? So that's why we put that there. Same thing with the trachea and the respiratory tract. This respiratory tract, it's connected from the mouth all the way to the deep lungs, right? That's one open tract with the outside world. So some characteristics of epithelial tissue. Epithelial cells. This is an epithelium here, a covering and lining epithelium. And it's made out of these epithelial cells. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cells that we see here. And all epithelium are very tightly bound. What are they bound by? Do you see these little brown things over here that are like spiders? These are called desmosomes, and they connect two cells together to form a continuous sheet with no spaces in between. If this is going to protect us, right, then we want them to be tightly packed. The deepest layer of epithelial cells are anchored to this basement membrane over here, okay? The basement of a house is the bottom layer, right? While the house rests on, or the epithelial rests on this basement membrane here. And actually, these are held down over here by what we call hemidesmosomes. Remember the half a desmosome? They will be found over here. There's also this top layer here that is called a free surface on one side, or an edge that's exposed to a body's exterior or maybe it's an edge exposed to a cavity of an organ, right? So this is just to say that all epithelium, they rest on one basal part, the basement membrane, and their top part usually is open to some kind of outside world or some kind of cavity, right, where there's a space. We call that the free space or the free surface. Um, the fourth fact about all epithelium is that they are avascular, right? Whenever we put a in front of a word, it means not. For example, asexual means not sexual, right? Avascular, vascular means vessels. Avascular means no blood vessels. Okay, so epithelial tissue are avascular. Epithelial tissue are also innervated. Nervated, right, means that there are nerves. Innervated is like a tissue is innervated full of nerves. So these contain nerves, right? Do you see over here these yellow nerves that are entering into the tissue? That's because epithelial tissue is innervated with nerves. All epithelium, I need you to know this very well. All epithelium also rest on a basement membrane, yes, which is a bunch of proteins, but that basement membrane rests on a connective tissue that is vascularized. This is very important. I told you there's no blood vessels. You don't see any blood vessels in the epithelial tissue. However, the lower tissue, all epithelia needs to rest on a connective tissue underneath that connects it down to the body, right? Remember, connective tissue is the super glue of the body. It connects it down. So this connective tissue has blood vessels, and thank goodness, because what did I tell you happens if a cell, any cell of the body, doesn't get blood? That means that it will die, right? It won't get oxygen, it won't get glucose, and it won't be able to get rid of its waste. So, this connective tissue, right, is vascularized, and it has oxygen and glucose that diffuse up over here to these cells on top to supply them with nutrients and remove their waste back down into the blood vessels, right? All epithelium, I repeat, all epithelium need to sit on a connective tissue or else they die, right? I want you to think of your skin. When you scratch your skin, right, do you see any, do you start to bleed right away? No, but you're actually sloughing off some of the cells that are on top. The minute you scratch very hard or a little knife actually goes a little bit deeper, right? Then you start to bleed. What does that mean? That means that the knife or whatever cut you probably got all the way through the epithelial tissue and actually managed to get to the connective tissue underneath, right? Because that's where the blood vessels are. The last thing, fun fact about epithelial tissues is that epithelium have cells that can regenerate rapidly. So mitosis or cell division may be apparent, right? Do you see these little basal cells here at the bottom? These like to make cells on top of it, right? And so they make new cells, which is good because this epithelium might get worn and torn by things that are on the free surface. So they need to be replaced at times. Okay, I want you to take a minute and in the following image, I want you to identify the following features, if present. I want you to find the epithelium, the free surface, the basement membrane, and the connective tissue. All right, so first things first, I'm gonna start with the epithelium, okay? So for the epithelium, right, we're looking for some kind of place where there is tightly packed cells, right? And we want to have these packed cells that are all close together, right? This is skin over here, right? All of this here, all this region is considered to be an epithelium, okay? You see these nuclei tightly packed together. Do you see the tissue underneath? These nuclei, the dark dots, they're very spread out, right? But all of this stuff here is epithelium. Over here, right, we see that all of this stuff here is an epithelial tissue too, right? It has all of these cells that are in line, tightly packed together. You see them all with their separate nuclei. This picture is a duct, and you see that there are epithelia that actually are sitting in a circle, right? And they kind of all are around this long tube. Think of a cylinder, like a toilet paper roll, right? All the cells would sit around that toilet paper roll and protect the outside of it. Now, let me get rid of this. Now I want to show you the free surface. The free surface is where it's exposed, right? All of this is the free surface on top of this skin layer, on top of the epithelium. This is like our skin epithelium, and this is what's above our skin, right on top of our skin. Over here, this picture is a bit misleading. This is the trachea, right? This is our trachea, and you actually have the trachea cells that line the outside over here. I'll put their little nuclei. These cells, I'll put little hairs here. There we go. All of these cells actually are lining this way and facing this is where air passes, and the cells are lining this way, right? So this would be where air passes here. This would be the free surface, and in this section, we're only looking at these cells here, right? We only get a sneak peek at these cells because it's hard sometimes the way we cut to get both of the sides of the trachea. But I want you to know that this is where the air would pass, and there probably would be another layer of cells that are like this way, right? Okay. Next thing, I want us to locate the base. Oh, sorry. Whoa. Next thing is in this over here, right? Remember these ducts over here that are making stuff or pushing stuff through it? The free surface would be these little parts here, the empty space, because that's probably where there would be substances passing through, right? This would be where, yeah, exactly, the free space where there would be stuff passing in it. Okay. Now I want us to think of the basement membrane, and the basement membrane is on the opposite side of the epithelium, away from the free surface. So remember, all of this was our epithelium, right? And the basement membrane here would actually be on the bottom over here, like a very thin line. I'm actually gonna change and draw this very thin line here. This would be where the basement membrane is. There'd be some proteins, some hemidesmosomes here, anchoring this down. Here, the basement membrane would be over right this way, right? And it would be anchoring it down over here. This is a bit hard. Here's my free surface. Here's my epithelium. So my basement membrane would actually be kind of around these cells here, anchoring it down to this tissue around. So it would be the external parts here, right? There we go. And next, I want us, the last thing to find is connective tissue, right? Connective tissue, remember, all epithelium sit on a connective tissue, and you know it's connective tissue because the cells are not tightly packed together. and the nuclei are very much more spread out. All of this is connective tissue here, okay? Because this epithelium is sitting on a connective tissue that is very loosey-goosey, okay? This epithelium sits on the basement membrane underneath a connective tissue, all right? And these different basement membranes, they sit on all of this connective tissue, which is very different than the nice epithelium you see surrounding the ducts, right? This is a connective tissue. This is an epithelial tissue. Remember, all epithelium sit on a basement membrane that connects it to the connective tissue. All right. So, on y va. Let's go to the next slide. So, over here, right, let's learn how to classify epithelial tissue. Structurally, humans have 8 types of epithelium, and most of them are named based on a system that actually makes a bit of sense. You name it using 2 words, a 2-word system. The first word indicates one or many layers of cells. So you're going to say, is it one layer of cell or is it many? The second word indicates the shape of the cell. Is it squishy? Is it cube-like? Or is it tall? So the first word you're going to choose, you're going to say simple, or you're going to use the term stratified. Simple means it is simply one layer of cells. Stratified, like the stratus clouds that are all spread out. You know those clouds that are all spread out and stratified, right? That is multiple cell layers. So if it's simply one cell layer, it's simple. If there's many cell layers, it's stratified. That's our first word. So look at all these tissues. Simple, simple, simple. Do you see that there's simply one layer of cells? Stratified has many layers, many layers, many layers, right? Now, the second word you're going to use is the shape. You're either going to say squamous. Squamous means squishy, right? I always think of squishy. Squamous is like a squishy cell. And why is it all squishied up? It's very small, right? Why isn't it just flat? Because the nucleus actually takes up a bit of room, so it does a little bump, right? But these are squamous cells that are squishy. These are the smallest types of cell. It could be instead cuboidal in its shape, and it's cube-like, right? Or it could be columnar. It could be longer than it is in length, right? Sorry, it could be a longer length than a width. So if it's a column, like a big column, right, like these huge columns, right, that are tall, those are columnar. So look at this. Here I'd call this simple because there's simply one layer, and it's squamous because these are squishy cells. This is simple because it's one layer, and they're cube-like cells, so they're cuboidal. This is simple because it's one layer, and it's columnar because they're nice column shapes. This one is stratified because it's many layers, and it's squamous because they're squishy cells. They're small squishy cells, okay? This is stratified, but they're cube-like cells. And these are stratified, but they're more column-like cells. These two here, I will not test you on at all. They're not really found in the body. They're not that found, so you could X out stratified cuboidal, and you could X out stratified columnar, but it just helps you to understand the point, okay? I want you to know of some exceptions to this. There is pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. Pseudo means fake, like pseudoscience is fake science, right? Stratified means many layers. So if it's faking being stratified, it means that it's not actually stratified. Like pseudoscience is not real science. Pseudo-stratified is not a real stratified layer. Why is it not a real stratified layer? Because these layers have a single layer. Look at the cells. They're all sitting on this basement membrane, right? And it's one single layer. But the cells have nuclei at different heights, right? So it looks like a stratified due to the nuclei, but it's not. That's why we call it pseudostratified, and they're column-like cells. Transitional epithelium is the other exception because this type of tissue has the possibility of transitioning from cube-like cells to squishy cells. And we're going to talk about it in the bladder. This is because it has the ability to stretch out. So let's get the ball rolling. Simple squamous epithelium. Simple because it's a single layer of flat cells. And squamous because they're nice squishy cells. Okay? So this is a single layer of flat cells. What do we think its function is? If I stuck you in a room and told you to think about what this function would be, I think you'd get. Definitely not protecting us that much, right? Because it's thin. But this is very good actually to allow certain substances to pass through and diffuse, right? So where do we think we would find it? I think we would find it in the deep air sacs of the lungs, deep in the alveoli, right? That's the pouches of the lungs. These air sacs in the lungs, right? That's where we exchange gases, O2 and CO2. We will also find it, these blood vessels are wrapped around by a thin layer of epithelium, simple squamous epithelium, because blood vessels also like to exchange these air. Imagine I had a thick layer to exchange air between. It would need to pass through each of these cells before getting to the other side. That would be super slow, right? So I'd rather have something that is nice and thin, right? And this is the thinnest of layers possible. They're squishy and they're simple. So an example, right? The layer of simple squamous cells lining air sacs of the lungs help with diffusion of gases, right? In the lungs, we have alveoli, these pouches of air sacs. And I want you to think of grapes again, with many grapes on a grap, right? That's how alveoli are. They are in all these little grapes. And if you slice the grapes in two, like that whole grap of grapes, if you slice it in two, you'll see the little pouches where the grapes are, right? You'll see circles where the grapes are. Well, here, when you slice the alveoli, you're going to see these pouches of empty space. This is where the air would be going to. And around it, right, you see that this is the circular like membrane that surrounds that little grape, right? But again, remember, cells are three dissections of tubes or sacs, so they appear as circles, right? You're cutting through these circles, so you only see the 2D image over here. So this is a typical one that you would see. They're single squishy cells. And why is this good? It makes it ideal for small distances for diffusion. Take a look at this. This is not in the slide deck, but I want to just supplement it. Here are the grapes that I told you about at the ends of the lungs. You have the air goes down the bronchioles all the way to the alveoli. This is where gases exchange between, here is the alveoli, here's the blood vessel, right? So oxygen comes in, CO2 comes out, right? At these grapes. If I cut the grapes in two, I will see the pouches where the air sacs are, right? And you see a nice thin single layer that's there, right? If I look at the blood vessel here, right? Remember I told you capillaries, these blood vessels, they also have a thin layer of simple squamous epithelium around it. And this is a very cool picture. These are red blood cells that are in this nice big blood vessel here, okay? All of this crap around it, though, that's not a tightly packed cell layer. This is around it is connective tissue, but here you see this nice simple squamous epithelium all around. All right, next one is simple cuboidal epithelium. Now, this is a single layer because it's simply one layer, simple, and it's cube-like cells, right? What is this good in? It's good at secretions and absorptions, okay? And I don't want you to memorize. I want you to understand why. This is a single layer, which means that it minimizes diffusion distances. So it's easy to pass through the cells still, but they're a bit larger cells compared to the simple squamous cells, right? So these simple cuboidals, they're a bit larger cells that allows them to contain more structures to produce substances and do gene expression a lot, right? So maybe these are cells that need to diffuse things easily, but at the same time, they need more cellular machinery, more enzymes, right? More gene expression to make certain things in here. So for example, maybe it's the pancreas that's making pancreatic enzyme. Maybe it's the salivary glands making a bunch of saliva, right? These things are making stuff. So an example of this, the kidney tubules do a lot of absorbing and also secretion. The ducts of many glands, all the glands you think of, this is probably the one I want you to remember. When you see this, right, many glands have this simple cuboidal. Pancreas, thyroid gland, salivary gland. So over here, right, remember, this is usual the duct or the tubule, so cells will be in this ring shape, right, like this. This is the lumen or the open space inside where the substance passes. This tube here, right, this layer of simple cuboidal is actually the real tissue in a kidney tubule, right, which is very important for absorbing things, right? So it's good because it could take in things into these cells, right? Single layer minimizes diffusion, and larger cells contains certain enzymes that might help them make stuff. So again, here I'm looking at the kidney tubules. You see, you're going to tell me that's not a perfect square, right? But sometimes it depends on the section, right? Here you see it in a longitudinal section. You see these nice cube cells all lined up along, right? And this is the lumen where that stuff will pass. So this is very useful for reabsorbing things, let's say, like from the urine in the kidney tubules. Alrighty. Next one is simple columnar epithelium. This is a single simple layer of tall cells, right? Their function is to secrete things oftentimes or absorb things. We're going to get to this in a second, okay? Where do we find these? We find these in the GI tract mostly. The stomach, small intestines, large intestines. And let's just talk about something before, right? They're a single layer, which makes distance of diffusion very easy and absorption very easy, right? But again, just like the cuboidal cells, they are larger column cells, so they can contain many more structures to produce secretions, right? Remember I said like the example of pancreatic enzyme or saliva, right? Well, let me tell you about this one. This one over here, right, in the small intestine, right, we're gonna show you these simple columnar epithelium, but they have something very unique to them. Do you see their plasma membrane has these ups and downs? I want to do a little drawing. If I took one of these cells, right, and I made these ups and downs and ups and downs and ups and downs like this, right? This over here, oh boy, this is my little plasma membrane. And remember, it's this bilayer of this plasma membrane, right? Well, that plasma membrane continues on and on and on. But for this cell, the plasma membrane goes up and around, right? Like it actually makes this loop-de-loop like this. And the phospholipids, they make these loops and they form these different ups and downs. The layer of simple columnar cells, right? This simple columnar layer has what we call microvilli. A villi is a little up and down in the membrane, okay? So I want to show you something over here, right? In the small intestine itself, right? Here is a normal lumen, right, which will carry stuff, but the small intestine's epithelium actually looks like this. Okay, it waves in these villi up and down, right? But what's even trippier, okay, is that if I zoom in even more, if I look at one little villi, okay, and I zoom into it, these little cells here, right? These little cells, you don't see it very well here, but they have their own microvilli, okay? So let's say this is one cell here. It has its own villi on its membrane. So each of these cells here have their own villi. So there's big villi, which are these guys over here, but then each of these cells, like this cell here, will have the ups and downs, ups and downs, ups and downs. Okay, so these are called microvilli, and the big ups and downs, these are the villi. Why am I harnessing on this? When you see a cell with microvilli, okay, that's when you know that this is definitely a simple columnar epithelium with microvilli. You know that these microvilli, right, are going to be the small intestine. Why? Because what does it do to increase? Let me zoom in onto this cell, right? Why would my cell want to do this? And why wouldn't it just want to be flat like this, right? In these cells, right, the small intestine we know absorbs things like nutrients. The small intestine has, if I were to absorb things and this were my small intestine cell, I could absorb things here, 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 or here, right? If I have this as my small intestine cell, I could absorb things here, 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 right up top here, over here, down, right, across, over here, and on and on and on. So do you see how these microvilli, they help to increase surface area? I want you to know this. Microvilli and villi, they help increase surface area so that we could absorb more things into our bloodstream. Okay? So when you see these, you need to think increasing surface area. So the nuclei often are in a neat row at the bottom in these simple columnar. The layer of simple columnar cells, right, often have microvilli that line the lumen of the small intestine and help to absorb nutrients. So here you might see it as this like little border, but these are actually little ups and downs that you can't see very well on these cells, okay? And those are microvilli. So on top of it, microvilli in the small intestine, they increase surface area for nutrient absorption. All right. Next type is the pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Pseudostratified because it's a wannabe stratified. Pseudo means fake, stratified because this is one layer all touching the basement membrane, but it's pseudo because the nuclei are at different heights, right? Now, a single layer that touches the basement membrane, but some of the cells are shorter than others, right? This one's a bit shorter and looks smaller, but it's not. What is the function of this? Number one, protection and secretion, and I'll tell you why. The only place that we see this and that we really care about is the trachea. This is the number one. Also, the nasal cavity, and it'll make a bit of sense why. This picture is misleading. I should have put like little brushes here like this. I know it looks like it, but these are very different. This is not the plasma membrane going up and down, okay? I need you to know that. This is not the plasma membrane going up and down. Instead, this is a rectangular cell, right? And on its surface, it inserts little brushes, little sticks, right? I like to think of it like a paintbrush. And these things are microtubules called cilia. And cilia, they will brush in one direction. They will literally, like the brush of a paintbrush, they swipe in one direction. So these are beading on and on. I want to show you this picture. Do you see these cilia here? They are not the plasma membrane. They do not absorb things. They are brushes that brush debris forward. That's why we see it in the trachea. The other thing that you'll see in these types of tissue are these white cells here that are very, very light. This picture has it nicely. Do you see these big glob cells? They look like a bit of a goblet, like a wine glass almost, right? They look like this little goblet of wine glass, right? These are called goblet cells, and they make mucus and they secrete it out over here. All right. And then the cilia, they beat that mucus in one direction. So the goblet cells, these are producing and secreting a sticky substance called mucus, which traps the debris or the bacteria trying to get into the deep parts of your lung. Remember, in the deep parts of the lung, what kind of tissue do we have there? We have simple squamous epithelium. But in the trachea, right, we have this pseudostratified columnar epithelium because we're not in the deep lungs yet. We still need to protect our airways here. So the goblet cells, they make mucus, they secrete it out, and then the cilia will beat the mucus upwards to all the trapped microbes and dust get pushed away from the lungs. They do not get pushed down, they get pushed up. And lastly, at the bottom here, there's these little regenerative cells. This is what the small cells at the bottom are. These are the ones that make the upper cells. So they're stem cells that make new cells. Okay, they're regenerating it. So look here in the trachea, right? We have these cells here. Goblet cells make mucus over here, traps the debris, and the cilia only beat in one direction and they push this upwards. This is called the mucociliary escalator because mucus is made, it's thrown here, it traps it in the snot. All the bad stuff gets trapped in the snot and that gets pushed up. And when you're really sick and it's gross, you actually need to swallow this after into your esophagus, right? Okay, next one is the stratified squamous epithelium. Stratified means stratus, many layers. Squamous means squishy. This is a thick layer of many cells that are flat. So the function of this is protection from abrasion, microbes, dirt, and chemicals, right? So think of, where do we find this? If there's keratin, which is a little top layer, we find this in skin. If there's no keratin, this will be found in any opening into our bodies. This is used for protection. It's thick, right? It's big, so we can protect ourselves. So definitely the skin, but the non-keratinized that doesn't have the waterproofing keratin on top, that's found in the mouth, the esophagus, the anus, and the vagina. These are all openings into our body, which are dangerous because microbes or other things could get in, right? So any opening to our body or any external part of our body that is exposed to the outside world will want to protect itself with the stratified squamous, right? And then as we get in slowly, then we can change the type of tissue for our function that we need, okay? So over here in this picture, you see a layer of stratified squamous epithelium of the skin, which protects the internal organs, right? All of this, I'll draw the basement membrane. All of this on top is the epithelium with many, 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 many layers, right? You see the little nuclei here with many layers, okay? And it protects the internal, it protects you from the outside world, or maybe if it's like lining some other thing, it could protect it from the outer organs, okay? So what's interesting, if it's keratinized like skin, the superficial top cells, right, this is interesting. Remember that let me start here, the connective tissue, which is below here, right? This connective tissue feeds the upper cells. But as the cells start, so this is the newer cells, and this is the older cells on top. As the cells start to migrate upwards, right, they start dying because they get further and further away from their blood supply. So the top cells here, these are dead cells. You even see that this is just keratin in the end, right? So these cells start sloughing off, and this is what dust is in our house. It's our skin cells that are falling off. So this keratin layer, right, that's made by these cells, this is a protein that increases toughness, and it also prevents H2O loss. So this is waterproofing for us too. The deeper cells, like the epithelial cells that are at the deeper levels here, they're regenerative cells, and as I said, they make they divide and do mitosis and make upper layers, and these layers slowly get pushed up, 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 and then eventually they die. All right. So let me just take a look at this. The skin is a keratinized type. So you see this nice basement membrane here. You see the epithelium that ranges, and eventually the cells die and they become this keratin layer on top. In the esophagus, we still need to protect the esophagus, because think of it, food is coming in, yes, but also a bunch of microbes in that. Until we get to the stomach and burn the shit out of everything, we need to protect our esophagus, or else microbes could enter our blood. So we need to put a thick layer to prevent that. Here, there is no keratin on top, right? Because it doesn't need any waterproofing or toughness. This is not like skin. But we still have this big, thick epithelium full of these cells, right? This is a stratified squamous. And lastly, we have this transitional epithelium, because it transitions from this to this. A multi-layer of cells, and the function of it is mostly protection because it has many, many layers, but also it has this ability to stretch when it's filled. So this is the one I want you to think of is the urinary bladder, okay? So the layers of transitional epithelium of the urinary bladder can stretch and protect us. So here's an empty bladder. The cells on top, we call them pillow-like. They're nice, big, and fluffy, right? Here you see some nice pillow-like cells on top. This is the inner part of the bladder, right? This is the connective tissue that would be over here. So over here, when the bladder is full, right, it pushes against the wall, right? That all this urine pushes against the wall, and these nice big pillows that were big and fluffy now become squishy and small. So that's transitional epithelium, and it'll transition depending on the amount of urine that's in the bladder. It has a lot of elastic fibers in it, okay? So here's a little review for you to try to figure out what types of cells are which. And this might be useful even during the lab to help you try to identify certain things. So I want you to try to do this activity on your own, and name the organ, the function, the epithelium, and explain how the anatomy allows the organ or gland to do its function. The next part is glandular epithelium. We have endocrine glands and we have exocrine glands, okay? Endocrine glands, endo means within, and glands are things that produce substances, right? Glands, they produce and secrete substances. So it's like a covering and lining epithelium, except it has an additional thing that it makes stuff. Endocrine glands make things, like here's an endocrine gland and it makes things and it pushes it into the bloodstream. And these are called hormones if they're endocrine glands. They're secreted into the blood. If it's exocrine, right, then these glands do not push things into the bloodstream. They push them on the outside of the body. They bring it out. So glandular epithelium, this epithelium tissue forms glands, which are cells or groups of cells that secrete and produce sweat, bile, or hormones, right? These are all examples. Sweat is made by sweat glands. Bile is made by the liver that has some glands. Hormones depends the hormone. Glands can be categorized into two groups. The exocrine is secretions that the body or the cavity through ducts. Example, mucus glands that are like goblet cells that are making stuff and secreting it into the outside of the body, which is in the trachea. Sweat glands secrete it outside the skin. Oil, sebum, secretes it onto the hair shaft. Milk, outside the body. Endocrine glands, secretions enter, here they enter the blood vessels, and they do not use ducts, right? So they do not go outside the body. So these are hormones, chemical messengers that can then go talk to a distant partner that's further away. So take a crack at this little activity here. The last thing to talk about is muscle tissue. There's different types of muscle tissues that contract to allow movement. So we have muscle tissue in general contracts, right? We have skeletal muscle, which is the muscle that you typically think of. This allows us to move. Skeletal, it means that it's on the bone, right? Smooth muscle allows things to constrict and dilate, and cardiac muscle allows the heart to pump. All muscle tissue is specialized for contraction and allows movement, right? But muscle cells, another name for a muscle cell is called a myocyte. Anything myo means muscle. Cyte means cell, right? Or sometimes we call it a muscle fiber. That is one muscle cell. So common features to all muscles is that they have a lot of blood vessels. they need oxygen all the time because they're metabolizing all the time. Each of these cells is constantly making ATP when it contracts. Tightly packed cells, right? A lot of muscle cells, they form sheets that are nicely packed. And the last thing is that muscle cells contain myofilaments. Actin and myosin are proteins that are in this muscle. Many, many actin and myosins. These things are the proteins that contract and shorten a muscle and then lengthen it back. Shorten, lengthen back. That's called muscle contraction. So actin and myosin are proteins that are contracting. They're myofilaments that are contracting. So here, if you zoom into a muscle and you look at this muscle fiber and you look inside the muscle fiber, you'll see this actin and this big myosin thick filament here. Okay, and these go bigger, smaller, bigger, smaller. Look at this. These little filaments, these actins and myosins, they pull the little heads of the myosin, pull on the actin and get them closer, closer, closer. So there are three muscle types I told you about: cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and skeletal. Skeletal muscle are long cylindrical cells, also known as muscle fibers, right? These are, look at these, they're big, they're parallel to each other, right? And they are multinucleated. Look at these many nuclei that belong to one cell. This one cell here has 3 nuclei. This is so that it meets high protein demand. Additionally, you'll see that this looks like a zebra. It has these light bands, these dark bands, these light bands, these dark bands. That's because they're striated. This is the actin and myosin that's all lined up in order. Okay? And that's why you see it. Let me show you back over here. Do you see the striations here, right? That's because this actin and myosin is all in order and you see the darker and lighter bands. Control. The skeletal muscle is the typical muscles that we think about that move our bones, right? So this skeletal muscle, right, is under voluntary control. For example, flexing your bicep. You can say, hey, go move that bicep. And you could do it yourself if I ask you now. Sometimes exceptions, it could be involuntary if it's part of a reflex. Okay, so like when you hit something, you move it away quickly. That's involuntary, but that's the exception. Okay. Functions of skeletal muscle, they form the typical muscle organ, right? Those organs that we talk about, like the biceps, the hamstrings, right? All the crazy muscles you learned about in lab. These are attaching bones to bones, like this bone to this bone, and they contract to bring the bones closer together or further together, right? They act as little levers. So if I look at this, what do I see? Big cells, multinucleated, many striations, right? This must be a skeletal muscle. Next one, cardiac muscle. How do I differentiate this under the microscope? They are branched cells. They still have striations. You don't see them very well in this drawing, unfortunately, but please believe me, there are mini striations over here. That means that there is actin and myosin that are aligned. However, and they are uninucleate, so they have one nucleus only. The thing that will tell you that this is a cardiac muscle is the intercalated discs. If you see these little zigzags here, right? Do you see these zigzags? Over here, over here, over here. These are called intercalated discs. These are structures that join the ends of one cardiac cell and the next one, right? You see here and here, this is the junction between the two. These intercalated discs, inter means between, right? These are for anchoring the cells together and communicating. We'll see that in a second. The control of the heart is involuntary. If I ask you right now to go and contract your right ventricle, are you able to go and contract your heart by just thinking about it? Or are you able to stop contracting your heart? No. That means it's involuntary. And actually, pacemaker cells in the heart, they just go and they modulate the heartbeat, right? We're able to do that. Like if we get stressed or that, like our heart could increase in rate, right? But it's really involuntary for the most part. Functions. It's the heart circulates blood in the body and maintains blood pressure, right? That's its general function. It beats and it pushes out blood from it. I want to take a second to look at these intercalated discs. Between two cardiac cells are these zigzags. Those are intercalated discs. What do they help to do? They help the heart synchronize together and contract simultaneously. In these intercalated discs between cell number 1 and cell number 2, you anchor down with many hemidesmosomes, okay? Additionally, you have these gap junctions, these junctions that are gaps with channels in them that allow ions to diffuse into the next one. This will allow a simultaneous contraction. When the heart beats, it beats all together. It's not lagging and spasming, right? So let's look at this drawing. Do you see the striations here? This one's a bit better. You see striations. You see one nucleus per cell. You see intercalated discs. Do you see these fuzzies here? These are intercalated discs. If cells don't communicate well and they don't have these gap junctions, then you get these scenarios where the heart is fibrillating or it's not doing the job that it's supposed to and it's contracting weirdly. The last of the muscles is called smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is short, and we say that it's spindle shaped. Here's a spindle and a thread. It has this like spindly shape, okay? It's thick on the middle, but thin on the ends. And it's uninucleate. Smooth muscle has one nucleus that's kind of in the center. They looked all meshed together, but they are one cell each, okay? And smooth muscle, they're called smooth because they appear to be smooth due to the lack of striations. They have no striations. Why? It's not that they don't have actin and myosin. They do have actin and myosin, but it's not parallel to each other. So you don't see the very nice striated lines because they're not parallel. Control, under involuntary control, they line passageways that need to move substances. For example, in the GI tract, you cannot go and contract your intestine, but there is smooth muscle around the intestine that contracts to help propulse food. Or in your blood vessels, you have smooth muscle to constrict it or dilate. You have no mental cognitive control over that. So the function controls the diameter and propels material. Here is our little spindle-shaped smooth muscle cell. And so you have the central nucleus, you have the long spindle shape, and they form these nice little sheets. All right, so that'll be it for the first two topics, and then we'll jump into connective tissue and nervous tissue.